Hello, my name is Jamie Irvin. I'm the host of the Heavy Duty Parts Report, and you are watching another edition of HDPR Live. We are coming to you live on LinkedIn on my personal profile at Jamie L. Irvin, as well as on our Facebook and YouTube channel for the Heavy Duty Parts Report. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. We're going to be talking about an important subject. What are we to expect in early 2021 in the trucking industry? That is the subject matter that we're going to discuss today. Before we do that, a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about. One, we put out a lot of content at the Heavy Duty Parts Report. You can go over to heavydutypartsreport.com and subscribe to our weekly email, and that way you won't miss out on any content. So head over there today, heavydutypartsreport.com. You can sign up to our weekly email. We're not going to spam you with a bunch of sales emails and marketing emails. It is just an email each Monday morning that reviews the content that we put out. That includes our podcast. It includes the blog articles that we're writing. It includes the replays of these live interviews. So head over to heavydutypartsreport.com today and sign up. Today, we're going to be talking to our returning champion guest. He's been on the show more than anyone else, Scott Boltz. And Scott is going to put a presentation on for us that is going to talk about what we can expect in early 2021. He has put a tremendous amount of work into this presentation. Not trying to put too much pressure on him, but he has done a really, really good job. I got a chance to look over it before we came on. If you would like to participate in today's conversation, we really want you to go ahead and comment. We will include your comments just like this, where we'll be able to see what you have to say and we'll be able to interact with you. That way you can participate in this conversation as we talk about an important subject, which is what to expect in 2021 in the trucking industry. We're really going to focus on the first few months of 2021 of what we think we can expect. So let's bring Scott into the conversation. Scott, welcome to HDPR Live. Glad to have you back.
Hey, Jamie, thank you. Good to be here. Thanks.
So we're going to bring up your presentation here and add it to the live stream. I'm just going to add it right there. But before we go to the next slide, you're going to start off by talking about hurricanes in Florida. I'm sure that most people were not expecting that. I certainly wasn't. I'd really like to understand why that's your starting point when talking about what to expect in 2021 in the trucking industry. And Steve Hoke is just commenting and saying that he wants to see into the crystal ball that you have, my friend. So let's get started. Why are we talking about hurricanes in Florida at the beginning of this presentation?
Well, first, that's good of Steve to chime in. I want his crystal ball, actually. We could trade. Yeah, that'd be fun. No, I like thinking in analogies. And, I can see a great correlation between how COVID has really affected us in terms of economics and how the evolution of how Floridians have reacted to hurricanes. So once I made that, kind of analogy in my head, I thought it was a good way to open up the conversation, right? And so really the way that I want this to flow is that we want to talk about how, not whether COVID is a thing or not a thing, or just how it's affected us economically as an industry and in particular to trucking, but also what does it look like come next quarter? So I've had the responsibility in several different capacities in my career to make financial projections. And so in that learning process, I was taught by a Columbia MBA, and it's an ongoing activity. We have to constantly keep looking in the near and the long term in order to make decisions on how we conduct our business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's see that next slide. Let's talk about hurricanes in Florida, and let's see the correlation. So the psychology of hurricanes in Florida, a pandemic analogy. I want to learn more.
Yeah, so my family moved to Florida in the late 70s, and the first hurricane that I can remember, there was many, but the first one that I actually really remember was 1985, and that was Hurricane Elena. And if you look at the track of it, and the colors matter, like it gets the more red the color, the more dangerous it is, essentially. And this storm came up through the Gulf of Mexico and button hooked towards, I live in the Little Thumb there. If you look at the state of Florida, there's that Little Thumb, that's called Pinellas County, and that's where I live. And the storm basically came right up to shore and sat there for a several number of days and dumped water and wind on us. And it was due to the nature of the cycle of the storm, the worst quadrant to be in is the lower right quadrant. That's where we were sitting for multiple days. And the neighborhood that we lived in, I lived on a cul-de-sac, and all the neighbors came out and were barbecuing and basically having a party because everyone got off of work. And there was no boarding up of windows. There was no rushing to Walmart and stocking up on water and toilet paper. It was essentially just a day off with a storm. And we wound up getting some flooding, not necessarily in our house, but it came pretty close. And, you know, for a 10-year-old boy, I got to canoe through the streets of my neighborhood, which was pretty sweet. Right?
You're not going to forget that.
No. And then what we see, you know, in Florida in 2004, we had 3 storms come through in one season. And, you know, I remember on the second storm going to Home Depot that morning, like before the storm hit, and buying plywood. And so, you know, if we fast forward to today, and then you include the 24-hour news cycle and you include social media, it creates this hysteria. You know, so if you couple that with Florida, with the influx of, you know, our state's always growing, and there's waves of, you know, let's call them other state immigrants, even Canadian immigrants in some ways. And they come with their perception of what a hurricane actually is. And so I call it, like, there's the stout group, and then there's these like crazy people. And so in November of this year, actually on Veterans Day in the United States, I was in Philadelphia making sales calls with one of my colleagues. And my wife called me and she said, "You need to get your butt home." I'm like, "Why?" And she's like, "There's a hurricane coming right for us." And I didn't even know, I wasn't watching it, right? Because it was just a tropical storm. And if you look at that map, you'll see the dots. The colors actually matter again. And you'll see it go from like a turquoise blue to like a yellow. And that's when it upgraded to a category 1. So I told the guy I was with, I was like, "Listen, drop me off at the airport. I'm going to fly home." And I couldn't get a flight because they had shut down Tampa Airport. There was no storm, by the way. There was nothing going on. It wasn't windy. There was nothing. And if you think about like where you live and how your airports deal with the winter, you know, you guys are impervious. You get out there and de-ice and fly out, right? You know, the same thing happening in Atlanta shuts the airport down. And that's what we experienced. So you cannot go to a Walmart or a Home Depot and get some essential supplies that you might need because there's such a mad rush on it, right? And my whole point in this analogy really is how we're reacting economically and how that affects the trucking market with regard to COVID is, in my opinion, a bit of an overreaction. And I'm going to give you enough data to make that statement.
Okay. So before we do that, now in the bar graph, what I found interesting is that actually the peak of hurricanes happened quite some time ago. Not everyone might be able to see, but the last peak that we had was several years ago. What year was that?
That was the 1960s. So every one of those bars is a decade.
Is a decade. Oh, those are decades. Okay. Yeah. So the last, it was the 1960s where there was the last peak of hurricanes. That's Correct. Interesting in itself because, you know, there's the perception of what's going on. Correct. And then there's the actual data to tell you what's going on. And if you asked anybody when the worst hurricane seasons, what decade the worst hurricane seasons were, they would have said
this year.
Right, this year or this last decade we just had.
Correct.
So that's interesting in itself. And, you know, one thing we want to go on record of saying is we're not minimizing that hurricanes can be dangerous and people do lose their lives. Right. And that is a tragedy. And so to anyone who has experienced that, you know, our hearts go out to you. So we're not minimizing that, but we are trying to draw a comparison here of how people react to things, the role that mass media and digital technology has played in changing our perceptions of things, and the actual reality. So now that we've kind of framed the conversation, we've used hurricanes as an example, we're kind of doing a correlation between that and the pandemic and the economic impact. What did you want to show us next?
Well, yeah, and I think you framed that out quite right. I'd just like to add one more note on it. Is
Sure.
The day after the storm, it's gone from the media, it's gone from everything, and life goes immediately back to normal, right? And so that you know, will play into kind of the message that we have. And I have really good news, I think, to let everyone know that there's the data indicates that the negative effect from the pandemic, we've already recovered from it in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. In some ways we haven't, in terms of unemployment and things like that. But in the grand scheme of things, we are looking at a first quarter next year, and then a second quarter next year for the first half of the year, it's going to be really, really promising. And I'm excited for what is going to be available to us to grow our businesses individually, right?
So what are you basing that optimism on? Let's start to break it down, because I think we all need a bit of good news.
Yes.
2020 was a challenging year, regardless of the level of impact COVID had on us. Like for myself, I was very fortunate. A couple of our family members did get sick, but they recovered. They didn't die. And other than that, we had to stay at home. And so we lost out on some travel for business and some social time. I didn't get to play hockey. I only got to a few games this fall, and they shut down our rinks because of the second wave. So, that's been the impact for me. That's my perception of it. Somebody else who just had a family member die, or like some of the people I've had on HDPR Spotlight who have been out of work since May through no fault of their own, they're having a different experience. Certainly. So we need some good news, regardless of what our experience has been.
Certainly. And I was personally affected too. I mean, I was part, if you look at the April unemployment numbers there at 14.7%, I was one of those guys. And, fortunately the next month I was not in the 13.3, right? And so, the company I was working for furloughed like a third of their workforce. And I was a part of that. But the real effect, what we really have to look at is the gross domestic product. And we're going to end at GDP. That's where we're going to end. But, just to open up the conversation, we're looking at 4.3% reduction year over year from 2019. It's significant, but it's not the Great Depression, right? We're not seeing a 30% reduction. We're not, so we're not seeing unemployment at, 25, 30, 40%. It's not as catastrophic as some may think.
And yet in the media for months, we've been hearing Great Depression level, that was headlines all through the spring.
Exactly.
And into the summer. And I still see it today. Like if you're on Reddit, for example, and you're following the economics subreddit, headline after headline after headline uses terminology that include Great Depression level.
Right.
Great Depression level this, Great Depression level that. And we're not minimizing people who are out of work right now.
No,
it's a struggle. But it's still not what it is presented as.
Correct. And again, here's the thing, you have to rely on the data. The data has to be good. Right. Mm-hmm. And if the data is good or relatively good, then you can make intelligent decisions about what you're going to do with your business next year. Right. And that's really the purpose behind this discussion. That's why I wanted to have this call with you. So let's there's certain things that are going to happen in the near term, probably in the first quarter, that are going to have significant impacts on the economy and therefore on the commercial nature of our business. Right. Because if GDP is up and moving and we're moving goods and agricultural outputs and energy and all those things, that's good for us because it runs on 18 wheels, right? Largely.
Right. And that's something I learned very early in my career, is that the trucking industry is actually a very good indicator of economic performance. So the trucking industry will often rebound and then the economy follows suit. Or if the trucking industry starts to rapidly decline, usually there's an economic contraction right behind it. So really looking at what's going on and predicting with good metrics and data where the economy is going is an indication of where the trucking industry is going, because the trucking industry is going to go there first, because like you said, in order for economic recovery, things have to move. How do they move? Well, primarily they move on 18 wheels.
That's right. And we're 4 slides away from me giving you a lot of really, really good news that's real, like, and demonstratable. Okay. So this idea around the vaccine is that we don't necessarily know if it's going to work, but just having it, we're going to get literally an economic shot in the arm, right? And you can see what happened in November after the election was over. Pfizer announced that they had the vaccine, it was in production, and it was 90% effective, and it was going to be releasing soon. And all of a sudden, the entire market kicked, right?
Yeah, we saw record highs on the Dow Jones.
Exactly, in all the indices.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the individual stocks, and then if you look at some ETFs, it was across the board. It was technology, it was energy, it was commodities, everything kicked. And in some ways, I'm kind of mad at that. Not that I didn't like the kick, but it wasn't real, right? It was a reactive. It wasn't like there was a vaccine the next day, right?
Yeah, many countries like Canada is just going to be getting the vaccine in the next week, and really the rollout won't be even taking a major effect until April.
Correct. So imagine if this was just the announcement of the news and the effect that we had on the market. If I remember correctly, I think the Dow was up like 6-7 points. It was crazy.
Yeah.
Imagine what happens when people actually start getting the vaccine.
Yeah.
And then, so the question then becomes, okay, if the vaccine is going to affect the economy and the economy runs on 18 wheels, what does that look like, right? So let's take a look. Again, before we get there, though, I just want to, these are just some random notes that really affect the kind of whole argument around what we've seen during the last year. Specifically, we fell off the cliff in late March, and April was just a disaster, and I'll demonstrate that. But what's happened is you'll see that, according to Wells Fargo, people are saving a lot more money,
right?
Because they're preparing for a winter, let's say, right?
And they're not spending right. That wasn't one of the things that, because we were gainfully employed through the entire first lockdown, my wife and I, we put a whole bunch more money in our account just because we weren't going to restaurants, we weren't spending, on retail. We just were sitting at home, working from home and watching Netflix. So we weren't spending money. So our income stayed the same, but our actual net amount of money in our account went up during that time, which, I almost felt guilty a little bit about that, because I knew so many people were suffering, but I was going, wow, I can't believe, it was a change of a few $100s a month, but it made a difference in how much cash we had.
It makes an enormous difference, right? And so there's some noise in that data as well. And so this is US data. So there was a stimulus check that went out to a lot of people making a certain amount of money or less, and so they were getting $600 a month if they lost their job. Some of that's in here too, right?
Canada had that too. We had a CERB payment, CERB, that's an acronym, and it was basically the same thing that the US was doing, just to give people who had lost their jobs the income they needed to keep paying rent and buying food and the necessities of life.
Right. And then also within the noise in that data is there was a significant number in the US of people that were playing the game of, should I retire now? Should I retire later?
Yeah.
And some of them pulled the trigger on that. And so they're starting to withdraw money out of their retirement accounts in a different way. Right. And so there's some noise in that data, but it's significant and real. The next thing that we really want to look at is the recovery of people in their jobs. Right. And so we saw a big dip in April, but if you look at the different quintiles, you'll see that, first of all, no one's back to normal yet relative to the scope. Right. But the large wage earners saw a less of a net effect, right? And that makes sense. There's less of them. They're in pretty influential positions. It's not those that get cut. And then if you move through the quintiles, as you move down the scale, you look at the lowest paying quintile, and they saw the biggest dip in employment.
Right.
But this is something else that often gets lost in the argument, is that most of those people are either seniors or teenagers.
Yeah.
There's not many 35-year-old dad of 2 kids, right, working a minimum wage job in the United States. Then again, that gets lost in the political argument often. It's mostly teenagers and seniors, mostly.
Yeah. You think of a restaurant, right? Like if they're running a really strong supper time kind of crew, a Boston Pizza or something. I don't know how many of them. There must be 30 young people, like in their late teens, very early 20s on staff part-time. And if all of a sudden capacity of that restaurant is dropped to 25%, well, 75% of that 30 people are going to get laid off.
Certainly. And the question here is, do they come back? And so we live in Florida, and we have a joke, and hope this doesn't offend anybody, but the joke is, where we live is home of the newlywed and the nearly dead. Right. And, and so if you go to Publix, the lady that's ringing up your groceries is a retired person, right? She's only has a job because she wants to be out. She likes people, yada, yada. Right. And so when we go into a lockdown situation and the economy is affected, do those people come back? Because they don't necessarily need to, right? My son doesn't need to go back to his job if it's not safe, right?
Right. And maybe they also say, well, that was a part-time job that I was, saving for next year of college.
Right.
I'm now enrolled in
Right.
my curriculum, and I'm doing it from home online temporarily. So I'm just going to stay home,
Correct.
focus on my studies.
Indeed. So not
Or
to
if
be,
you're a retired person that doesn't actually need the income, you're not going to take that job from somebody who does, when you can just stay home. Also, your health might be a higher concern, so you're saying, well, I'll let my counterpart take the one job that's available. I'll stay home because it's too risky for me to go out anyway. I'm in that high risk category.
Indeed.
Okay, makes sense.
So then let's start drilling down in actually what we care about, which is the trucking industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the good kind of marker points that I follow is this, the ticker is XTN. It's a spider ETF that incorporates transportation, and that includes trucking and rail and some other things, right? It's not just trucks, but I find the graph of this individual ETF really interesting, because you look going back into March and how it was kind of floating on the $68, $67 range. And then once the lockdown started, everything tanked, right? Mm-hmm. Everything tanked. And it started this slow climb out, right? And slowly climbing out. But the interesting thing, I think, specifically from this graph, is look where we are today.
Yeah, we're actually higher than than Q1 of 2020 before the lockdown and the collapse.
Correct. And then on the right table, if you look at some of those like big names that we all know, and I put this up there just to make the comparison. If you look at their 52-week high and you look at where they're at now, we're essentially back to February, if not February, October, right? Like, so.
Yeah.
So the doom and gloom and everything, if you don't have any of this data, then you can have the sense of, the hurricane's coming still, or we're devastated by this hurricane. We're not, right? Like, so things are different, and we'll talk about the new normal. So let me just keep going.
Yeah, sure. Well, just before you go on that, you can leave it on this slide. Okay, we'll leave it there. What you're seeing when you see that collapse and then you see that recovery, that's been going on for a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
And really, where all the wealth is generated is in April at the bottom. That, like, if you're not trading on the stock market, but and you don't understand this, you don't realize that, this is when business acquisitions are made. Yep. This is when people dump millions or even billions of dollars into the market at that time, because it's like, if you've been saving for a Lamborghini and it goes on sale once in your lifetime and it's 50% off, you're going to buy it. Mm-hmm. Now, I know most people can't get their head around buying a Lamborghini, but it drives home the point. When the stock market collapses like this, it's just on sale.
Right.
And if you put more money in the right places, that recovery arc that happens is where all the wealth is generated. And a lot of people really don't understand that. So I think that's an important thing to remember, is that when the media is crying doom and gloom, most often in the last 200 years, this is good news, right? It's like there's an opportunity to generate a lot of wealth in a very short period of time. And as we've seen, it only comes around every 10 years or so. Right. It doesn't happen very often. And like the housing crash and this crash, those may be a once in a lifetime opportunity that we just may not see again, or maybe we will. But the point is, this has been the thing. And if you bet against the US economy, then you're going to say, okay, well, we've crashed this time and it's never coming back. But as long as you kind of think that the US economy is going to recover globally, this is what's going to happen.
Fully agree, Jamie. And I hate to keep doing this to you, but there's a bit of fourth turning in that too, right?
Of course. No, absolutely. It's part of the cyclical nature of the market and of human beings. So, if anybody wants to learn more about the fourth turning, you can go back to one of the HDPR lives that Scott and I did, where we talked about the future of heavy duty parts distribution. So you can take a look at that.
Indeed. And so, this is just randomly picked 18 different stocks, right, that are all related to what we do. There's Old Dominion, UPS, JB Hunt, Meritor, Schneider, Ford, PACCAR, CSX, Borg Warner, Heartland. I mean, you guys know the tickers, right? Knight, Swift, Werner, Navistar, etc. And notice what they have in common. Don't worry about the colors. They don't matter. Notice where the 52 weeks highs and lows, which are those gray dots, right?
Yeah.
Everybody just tanked. And like you said, Jamie, tremendous opportunity if you have if you're blessed enough to be able to invest, right, at that time and be reactive and to see over the next horizon, and that's what we're trying to do right now. We're trying to understand what Q1, Q2 look like.
Yeah, and just so everybody there, I put it in the comments. There's the link to that discussion we had about where we talk about the fourth turning. So if you're not understanding what we're talking about, this is in the comments now, and you'll be able to use that link to learn about that. So I just wanted to incorporate that in the video.
Certainly.
Okay, so this is what we're seeing. So these are the indicators. So explain to us why this is important to any of us that work in the trucking industry.
Well, I'm trying to make the point that we're recovered, essentially, Yeah. And again, we may not be recovered to the point that we were in February, but we're recovered to the point that maybe we were in October.
Right. And not every stock is seeing record highs. Like some of them are just back to where they were.
You have to aggregate it.
Yeah.
So let's get off that and move on. So this is kind of a pet peeve of mine when you hear people talking like, I can't wait till we get back to can't wait till we get back to normal or I can't wait till we establish some new normal.
Right.
In my
really, people are just looking for certainty, right?
Correct.
It's really what that statement is. Like even the new normal, it's like, okay, well, it's not the old normal. And there's an implication that the old normal was awesome, which it wasn't. But it wasn't as bad as everybody thought either. Correct. And the quote unquote new normal is not going to be great as everybody hopes. It won't be as bad as everybody hopes either. It's just reality. So whatever reality is reality.
Correct. And so wherever you're at in the moment, that is normal. And it won't be tomorrow, and it wasn't yesterday, right?
Yeah.
And so kind of to establish that right now, typically in a recession, housing values fall. Mm-hmm. And trucking is directly correlated to housing, whether it's new construction or not, right? Because there's a lot of things that correlate between people's consumption and their ability to move and upgrade houses or purchase homes and et cetera.
Of course.
Because the Fed is suppressing interest rates right now. I just refinanced my house. I have 2.25% interest, Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy awesome, So my point is we're not seeing this housing crash during this. If you're going to call this a recession, we're not seeing a housing crash during it. Right. You're actually seeing housing values going up.
Just like an FYI to younger viewers who weren't there. I mean, I wasn't there, but I was, but I was a baby in 1982. Interest rates were topping like 20%.
Correct. And
so now today, 40 years later, interest rates at 2.5%. Like that is crazy good.
It's crazy good. And we don't know how long that can sustain. And I'm not a financial guy, right? So I can't opine about that. But what I can say is I can take advantage of the reality as it is in the moment in the new normal, right? Which won't be normal tomorrow. So yeah. So that's kind of the point around that.
As Steve brought out, our crystal ball only goes so far. So sorry, Steve. Yes. We can't predict that.
Exactly. So that's why I like talking about quarters, because we can have a pretty good feel about what next quarter is going to do, because it's only a handful of days away, right?
Yeah.
And you start getting out into the first half of 2021. What's the second half of 2021 look like? That becomes more difficult to see over multiple horizons, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so this is kind of the backslide towards the end, but there's a statistical website that I subscribe to called Statista, and these are directly related to the trucking industry. I couldn't really break out if that included manufacturing, but I think this is just the freight companies.
Okay.
But here's the point about this: is if you're looking at a 1.1% compound annual growth rate, that's positive. There's a plus sign.
Yeah.
Right. And so, if you go back and you compare 2020 through 2024 to the years previously that are in the books, we're essentially back to where, the new normal is going to be, which is a lot in terms of volume and revenue, as much like the old normal. Right. The sky is not falling is my point.
So by 2024, at that rate, we're actually going to be much higher than we were at the previous high point in 2019.
That's going to happen in 2022, according to this projection.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we reached it in 2022, and then beyond that, we're seeing growth over where we ever were before.
Correct.
Yeah. And that 1.1%, that's down a little bit from projections, because I was doing some investing portfolio work a couple years ago and looking at the trucking industry and talking to some private equity companies and things like that. And we were seeing that the parts side of the industry anyway was projected at growing at 5.5%, and that is down. And I understand this is freight companies, but I know that the parts growth projections are down from the 5.5% that was projected from 2020 to 2025. So it's not that all that has happened hasn't come at some cost or some impact, but to your point, the quote unquote new normal is something that is in the positive territory, at least of what the projections are looking right now.
Correct. And Jamie, you have to make a distinction between how you calculate CAGR, or compound annual growth rates, and year-over-year growth.
Yeah.
You can have 5%, growth over a period of time, but the CAGR is going to be less.
Yeah, that's right.
It's the goal of a growth rate and calculation is to take the noise out, right? And so if you keep the noise in, then you get your 5. It's both are true.
Yes. Yeah. I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at registrations, because registrations are what matter. Class 3 through 8 trucks, there's little change. Going out to 2022, look at those graphs. On the left side, it's pretty stable. And if the projections are as stable as the past has been, then you can predict performance on past performance, right? In terms of how the market is affected and who's consuming parts.
Right. Yeah, because of course, all those trucks that are being manufactured within 3 years, most of them are off of the first tier of warranty, and then the aftermarket kicks in. And so, really, when you look at aftermarket, you can look with some level of confidence even beyond 2022, based just on new registrations that are happening right now in 2020, early 2021.
Correct. And then the graph on the right is kind of a breakout in terms of class vehicles. But we can actually get into class 8 and look at the breakout between OEMs, right? So the grays are Daimler, the reds are PACCAR, Navistar is in that teal, and black is Mack Volvo. If you actually stack those up, those percentages have held pretty true over the recent history, right?
Yeah.
And if we can say that the trucking market is going to be relatively stable, we're not going to see these big swings, then these percentages still hold true, and you can make, again, predictions on the relative volume of your aftermarket portfolio relative to these percentages, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So is that stability is speaking to certainty. But here's the thing. If the media came on and said everything's going to be fine, everything's good, we have nothing really of that big value to talk about today, see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Their business models collapse. So
Correct.
they're invested in winding you up, and then if you're not wound up, then the people who are wound up will do something which will be reported, and then that'll wind you up. So either way, whether you're wound up by what you see today or what you're going to see tomorrow, the goal of big media is to wind you up and get your attention, and to hold that attention as long as possible. That's their business model.
Yes. The hurricane's coming and you need to hoard toilet paper.
Exactly.
Except for the day after, you can go to the store and get toilet paper. So it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think starting to make sense now, right?
Exactly.
All right. So I wanted, again, to address a couple things for takeaways for Q1 and then going into the first half.
Okay.
And I have a Zoom background, and it's a bunch of guys in the 1920s holding sandwich boards that say the end is nigh. I love it, right? Because it's a joke when I'm on certain groups, right? But the joke here is the beginning is nigh, and whatever beginning of what, the new normal, whatever that means. So we see, Jamie, I know this is a hot button topic for you, but you see this huge spike in e-commerce sales, right?
Yeah.
And it's not going to fall down to where it was before.
No.
The old normal.
No, because and that, I think that's simply because there were some people who were resistant to it, who were forced to try it. And out of that group, some of them are going to go, I didn't like the experience. I want to go back to the way it was, which is fine. And other people are going to be like, that wasn't that bad. I actually kind of enjoyed that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like a good client of mine, Tyler Robertson, Diesel Laptops, his wife was kind of saying to him just recently, I miss shopping. I want to go back shopping. So she did. And she came home and said, I don't miss shopping. It sucked. And so she's going right back to online purchasing. And I know that's not a direct correlation to heavy duty parts, but it does show you how some people will find a bit of nostalgia for it and go back, and others will be like, no, this was actually pretty good. Yeah. We're going to incorporate that in what we do going forward.
Indeed. And so as we alter our behaviors, they're permanently altered.
Yeah.
And so, anyway. So the next one is the real personal consumption expenditures, right? And so if you remember back to the savings graph, this correlates to that we pulled back on our spending, we were saving more. And then as we're starting to eke out of the exhaustion that we have with these lockdowns and our restricted travel and all those things, and our inability to be with our families on holidays and things like that, we're starting to pull out of that. And
yeah, I mean, I've already started spending. So yeah. I saved a bunch of money. I just invested in new camera equipment. We're waiting for one stinking cable to show up by e-commerce so that I can actually stop using this webcam and start using a professional camera. We invest and we decided not to buy that on e-commerce, by the way, because we wanted, our leaders here in Alberta begged us to spend money with local businesses to help the economy. And so we went to Edmonton by telephone and ordered up what we wanted, and they shipped it to us.
That's great.
So, that was just our way of supporting local business in a tough time. But I know myself, my family, we're spending some of that savings for sure. And we haven't even begun to start thinking about holidays, business travel. Like, we'll be ingesting a lot of money personally into, a lot, that's relative speaking to per person, but we will start spending a lot more in 2021 as things change and allow us to do the things we've been holding off doing.
Certainly. And so again, this data just substantiates that, and so it's one thing if it's you and me, it's a different thing if it's a whole bunch of people doing a similar behavior.
Well, I mean, I think we're great, but let's face it, we're pretty average guys. So if we're doing it, pretty much we're right in the middle of the bell curve. So there's a large group of people in our society that are, following similar trends. So
well, Jamie, that's good news, because that we have the potential to maybe someday be great.
Maybe we could be a little better. Yeah,
maybe.
Exactly.
No doubt. So like I said in the beginning, we're going to kind of end with gross domestic product because it is the best indicator for the volume and the trend of a national economy, right? So you look at Wells Fargo's forecast for U.S. real GDP on the left. If you take your thumb and cover up that little dip, right, not much of a change, right?
Yeah. If you didn't know the dip was there and you looked at the macro, you wouldn't even realize that anything happened.
Correct. I can take my marker and connect those to the blue line and the brown line,
and it would have just looked like an ongoing.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's good news.
Yeah.
Okay. It is a forecast. It's not like it's history, but it's good news.
Right.
And then the one on the right is also GDP, but basically comparing your annual growth rates to your year-over-year percentage, which is what we talked about with the 1.1 and the 5, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's this big dip and then this big rise and then back to normal, right?
Makes sense.
It's a reason to have some hope, right?
It is. So, okay, so let's talk about this, and then I do have one question I'm holding back that I want to ask you. So let's talk about this first.
Certainly. So this is just a different data set about the same thing, but this is global GDP. And you look how China is affected, how India is affected. They're going to be seeing predictably some tremendous growth into 2021, 2022.
Right.
That's significant. The blue line is us, meaning the U.S.
The green is following, just at a smaller scale, which is
correct.
That's the way Canada is, right? We're 10% of your population, so we're going to follow your trend, but at a lower rate.
Correct. And then you also see a similar pattern within the EU. So,
which is interesting in itself, because there's a whole bunch of geopolitical implications coming that, at least in the near future, maybe this will hold, but perhaps in the future that'll change. But it's not going to change for North America.
Not at all.
Yeah. And even China, in itself, like, I mean, they may see big growth for a while, but there's some real reason to believe that in the future, North America will continue to outperform globally other nations and other entire continents. So
yeah, China's that's a whole different.
That's a whole other subject. Yeah.
Exactly. So
So
you picked a question.
I did. So this has all been very interesting. We have some good data that's solid. So it's not like we're just pulling ideas out of the air. Here, I'm going to stop sharing that screen. Oh, what did I do? Hang on a second here. There we go. Still learning the technology. So, okay. So my kind of question to close out our conversation is this. If you are in the parts business, if you are in the trucking industry in some way, how does all of this impact your decisions going into 2021? Obviously, we can't give specifics because we don't know the individuals watching, but let's give some general things, kind of best practices or rule of thumbs that will help people to think about their 2021 perhaps in a more positive way. And how does that translate to real world action?
Well, certainly, I think if you want to grow and you're not riding a wave, essentially, you want to grow through force and not essentially organically, it requires investment, right? And so how do we invest as a business? Do we invest in capital equipment? Do we invest in inventory? Do we invest in people?
Technology.
Absolutely, all of that.
Yeah.
And so if you hold the keys to the kingdom and it's your wallet that the company is spending, you need some reliable information that says, if I make this investment, we have a potential to grow this much. But if the market's going to fall over the cliff, why would you do it?
Right.
So in terms,
you don't want to be the guy that buys high and then has to sell low.
Oh, right. You don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
But in terms of, for instance, global emission systems, we're looking to make significant investments in property and production, in supply chain, in people, in technology. So I have to give the board and our CEO some confidence that the next horizon, if you look over it, is good, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not to be created, meaning that you're not creating a rosy picture just for the sake of creating a rosy picture. If it was dangerous on the other side, then we should know about that.
Absolutely.
The way that I interpret the data, which could be wrong, is that we have a lot to look forward to. And if historically in our business, December kind of tapers and January kicks, right? Yep. So I'm looking forward to that kick and then where it goes from there, because I think it's going to continue to keep a steady slope upwards.
Right. And no doubt 2021, there's going to be some continued implications from the pandemic, but I think as the year goes on, we're going to see that impact fall, especially with now the introduction of the vaccine into the equation. And 2021, I think we could see us ending that year quite strong. And I know at the Heavy Duty Parts Report, we're investing too. We're investing in new technology. We're investing in people. We want to grow. So we're, and that's my money and my wife's money that we're spending. So that's not just me, spending some board or some like private equity firms money, which is, kind of fun to do too, but I'm actually putting my own hard-earned money where my mouth is. So, if that's worth anything to people who are listening, then hopefully we've given you a lot to think about and enabled you to look at things from a positive perspective.
Indeed. There's a book called Illusions. I read it a long time ago by a guy named Richard Bach. And the premise of the book is that he's given a book that has no words in it, no page numbers. You just have a thought, open it up, and something's in there. And so he gets the advice out of this book for a long journey.
Right.
Here's the joke. The last time he opens it, it says everything in this book might be wrong.
Yeah. That's correct. That's correct. Well, Scott, thank you so much. I know you put a tremendous amount of work into this. This is one of the first episodes that as the host, I was actually along for the ride and just got to to enjoy your presentation. You did all the work. Thank you so much for supporting the Heavy Duty Parts Report and HDPR Live.
I'm a big fan. Thank you again for having me. I always enjoy it.
Awesome. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode of HDPR Live. We are coming to you live every Friday at 10 a.m. Mountain, 12 Eastern. Next week, we are going to be bringing on John and Buck from the Independent Truck Repair Group. They are going to discuss how they are supporting independent truck repair shops. And I think you'll be interested to see the way that they're supporting them, some of the challenges repair shops are having, and some of the opportunities that are available to the independent repair sector of our great industry. If you would like to be a guest on HDPR Live, go over to heavydutypartsreport.com/live. That's heavydutypartsreport.com/live, and you will be able to fill out a form. And once you submit that, we'll get back to you within a couple business days and let you know if we can have you on the show. Thank you for all the continued support from our regular listeners. Jose, always nice to have you on the show as as someone listening and someone participating. Thank you so much. And I would like to just wish everyone a great weekend. We will talk to you next week.